All right, I think we should go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Natalie Fulkerson, Collection Services Librarian at HathiTrust, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'd like to welcome you to our final HathiTrust Community Week 2020 session entitled HathiTrust and Interdependence. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before I introduce our speakers. First, HathiTrust events adhere to our Member Meeting and Community Week Code of Conduct, which can be found on our website and on the slide shown here, and will also be posted into the chat. Please keep your cameras turned off and your microphone muted throughout today's session. We have two speakers today, so to switch between active speaker view and gallery view, you can use the toggle at the top right-hand corner of your Zoom window. Closed captioning is enabled for this session, and you should be able to see the captions scrolling at the bottom of your screen now. You can disable the captions by clicking on the live transcript button in your Zoom toolbar. This session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. We'll also send out a link to the recording after the presentation. My colleague, Melissa Stewart, will be providing technical support for the session. So if you have any technical issues, you can send a chat message directly to her and she'll assist you. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. There's no Q&A feature in this version of Zoom, so please type your questions into the chat and I will read those out loud during the session. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, you have two options. First, you can send your message or your question directly to Angelina, who will not provide your name when questions come to me for the panelists. Or you can use the rename function in Zoom and give yourself a non-identifiable moniker like anonymous prior to sending your question. Finally, you can keep today's discussion going on Twitter or on the HathiTrust community Slack space, and our hashtags are here. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Mike Furlough, Executive Director of HathiTrust, and Aviva Weinraub Lajoie, Vice Provost for University Libraries at the University at Buffalo. Over to you, Mike and Aviva.
Thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate it. How are you doing today, Aviva?
You did not join the call earlier. I've had better days, but I'm doing okay.
I'm glad this next hour will be great. It'll be the best part of the day. So thanks for joining us. So Aviva and I agreed we would structure this as a conversation. There are a few things that we've agreed we want to try to cover, although we're going to leave plenty of room to range. And if you have things that you would like to hear us talk about, ask us about, or clarify, please do type into the chat. I'm going to kick this off by just commenting a few points, just reflecting a little bit on the last week, which has been just truly amazing and the culmination of just like weeks and months of work on behalf of some of my colleagues here. And it's been just a tremendous pleasure to sit in on all of these sessions this week and hear from our colleagues at other organizations, our member organizations, about how they're using HathiTrust. I felt like throughout the week I could really see in it happening the kind of resilience and interdependence that I discussed during our member meeting presentations last week. I felt like, on last week's member meeting, I was just thrilled, especially with the panel session that was led by Elaine Westbrooks, featuring Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Lisa Henschliff, and Patricia Sway on interdependence and crisis, because it was just the right kind of, for me, the really good broad discussion about being in a scary moment and one that's also potentially generative. I mean, there are actually good things that can come out of this scary moment, but it's also just realistic about the challenges that are there. And it's just rare. I feel like we have opportunities to talk with such candor and honesty about this stuff. For me, also this week has been, and I think everybody on the team agrees with this, it's been fantastic being able to include more people in this event, because normally what we do is we pack up for a couple of days and go to Chicago, and only so many people can come to Chicago. And we've kind of always wrung our hands about how to reach more people. Well, thanks to the pandemic, we didn't have to wring our hands any longer. And for me, one of the best things about this week has been seeing in the meetings, seeing questions coming from people who are really doing the work on the ground in your libraries. I talk to a lot of different people all the time, but there's a lot of folks in libraries I never get to meet, and I'm just seeing lots of new names and new faces this week, and that's been been also really fantastic. There was the other thing that's coming through for me this week is just the amount of deep knowledge that so many of you have about HathiTrust and its value and its impact on your students and faculty and staff. One good example of this for me this week was the first session we had on Monday from Corinna Baksix at Harvard, who talked about discovery and access using ALMA, just a really in-depth presentation about options for going through that. But also other kinds of presentations like those from Chris Prom and Jeff Kosakoff and our colleagues at the California Digital Library about emergency access, how it's being used, what they're learning about the access patterns on their campus, or what they're not learning, what they wish they could learn. And you're talking about the strengths of the service as well as some of the weaknesses, right? It was meant to be, we implemented as more or less as a bandage, expecting things to not be quite so long lasting. And yet here we are, and we're going to need to continue working on it going forward. The last couple of things I just want to comment on is that in addition to all of that, it's been a good chance for us to learn what people need or don't know, and what more we can do. And I think especially Monday's user engagement task force session called Choose Your Own Adventure was really enlightening for me for that. Just hearing what people needed to know, what their honest thoughts were, what's the first thing that comes to your mind, that kind of Rorschach test, it's a little bit humbling sometimes to see the things that come across. It just gave us good feedback on what we need to be working on going forward. That's just a real rough kind of summary. I think there's a lot more we could talk about, but Aviva, I wanted to ask you if you could are there things that stand out for you over the last week as notable? You're a member of the program steering committee. You've been a member of our statement of values and code of conduct task force. So you're a little bit closer to a lot of the things that we do than a lot of people are, but I don't know how that colors your impressions.
So there are really two things that I think kind of struck me this week. And I Mike, you touched on a lot of the really great conversations. I think when I go back and think about it, one of the things that strikes me, especially about Community Week, from where I'm sitting, which admittedly is pretty far away from day-to-day work, it really felt to me like it was a really valuable experience because it was so focused on the operational work that staff are doing. And the sessions were, they were longer than 5 minutes, which I think was the time that we've had in the past. And so it really gave people, from my perspective, a better idea of what folks are really doing kind of day to day. And I guess it struck me that this seems like there's a real opportunity here to have some kind of a regular catch up or a regular conversation for people to allow those members to tell and show more of that local work, which I think kind of ties into my second thought on this, which is that a lot of us, I think, look, I'm going to say this, and if you've ever heard me ever talk about software, it's literally the same thing, right? We're all trying to do the same thing, right? We're coming from very different institutions. We may have different things that we're using to make this work, but we're all trying to do the same thing, right? We're all trying to submit to Hati. We're trying to assess the ETAS data. We're trying to make things seamless for our users, but we're all approaching it differently, right? And that's hard on HathiTrust. It's hard on the institutions, and it's not. This is not an indictment of Hati, right? As you said, right? There was this really quick pivot transition to ETAS, to making this kind of work longer term. But I think that we're now at this point where you have limited staff, we all have limited staff. We need to start thinking about a common strategy so that we're not all reinventing that wheel over and over and over again. But again, that's a horse that I like to beat a lot. So
yeah, that's okay. I think that's a really important point because we've tried over the years to build something that is a common solution for certain kinds of problems, right? It can't be the common solution for everything, and that's ultimately the challenge. But I've spent some time this past year, in particular, trying to think a little bit about where we as an organization fit in this larger ecosystem of community investment, community infrastructure. And I know that's something you've thought a lot about. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit there because, you point out we still have all these different workflows for different things. But also, I know from the open source software community, the digital library world, that reinventing the wheel and not invented here are really common challenges, right? Yeah. That there's a real there's a right thought about needing to support a local constituents who have particular needs, but that often leads us into various particular solutions. I'm wondering, do you feel like in this moment going forward in the, in the current world that we're living in with, pandemic and economic crisis, political crisis, I mean, is this one of these clarifying moments where there's an opportunity for real change in how we think about coordinated action, whether it's through, community funding or software development or any of those?
I mean, I think the answer to that is, of course, yes, but, right? I mean, I think there have been a lot of us that have been talking for some time about flipping membership models, right? So if you look at open source software spaces, certainly in library land, right, they are so much predicated on this membership idea, right? You pay in, you have a seat at the table, you help to define what the work is. And, that's great. And it works in my mind as a sort of startup phase of things. When you start talking about sustainability and how we make sure that these tools and products that we're investing in collectively have a longer term shelf life, I don't think we've done as good of a job of figuring out how to sustain things, right? We as a community are not made up of business leaders, right? That is not where our strengths are. And so I think that sometimes when we talk about kind of how do we actually think about where does this go, I think that is one of the problems that we have. I do, however, think that what I'm hearing on my campus, and certainly with my faculty and the administration, is a very different kind of conversation since the pandemic began about how we share information and how we do that as an institution has value for sort of this larger landscape, right? And I think that the COVID research and the work that's happening around COVID more generally, and the way that people, I mean, sort of lay citizens are seeing that work happening in a much more connected environment, I think is allowing us to have different kinds of conversations with our administration, right? So administrations are seemingly more interested in trying to invest in some sort of research data infrastructure, although none of us have any money, right? I don't know of a single institution that's sitting there saying, I can hire with impunity, I can invest in these projects. And so I think one of the things that I keep thinking about is like, we can actually take this time as an opportunity to really think about how we might want to flip different models and how we might want to explore different ways of creating sustainable spaces, because we have about 20 years of experience now building and trying to sustain software. And I think that if you look at it really kind of thoughtfully, you can see that this path is not the path for sustainable futures. And if we want to try to implement this more and more across our institutions and have more networked sharing of information, we need to be thinking a little bit differently about what this means, right? And Mike, you've heard me say this before, when I think about membership, I think that even just the name, the using words like membership can sound so exclusionary. And when we think about what the work we're often trying to do in these spaces, it is about inclusion and not exclusion. And so sometimes I think when we even talk about membership and we talk about what it means about buying your place at that table, that it can be really hard for us to have, I think, meaningful conversations about where we go in terms of inclusivity and where we go in terms of sustainability.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's certainly one, that point about the problem of the word membership and the sense of it, leading necessarily to a kind of an exclusionary, inside outside kind of model. I've been thinking about that a lot this year in particular, because as we were rolling the emergency access service out, we were thrilled about it, but it didn't take very long to start to recognize, well, we are an organization that is providing access to these institutions, these organizations, and not these, and these others have not had an opportunity to invest, and they don't have the opportunity to take advantage of it. Now, many libraries did join us during this pandemic, but that also raises a little bit of a concern for me about folks looking at what is intended to be kind of a community investment program model as more of a transactional experience, right? You're coming here because you can get this thing and you need this thing, and the relationship is defined by that. And what I'm rambling a little bit here, but over time, HathiTrust has tried to think about itself as a membership organization that is trying to transform the field. Now, the way we've done that's been really different from a lot of the open source systems and communities that you were referring to, Aviva, because instead of creating something and putting it out for others to use in local practice and building it together, it's been a lot more centralized. You know, it's not something we don't build something and then you take it and run with it. It's still fairly centralized and managed. There's some legal reasons for that, but also efficiency reasons. But I think the real challenge that I fear a little bit in the coming years is that all of these ways that we have come to develop funding to do new things, you know, to invest in community resources, are going to be really challenged because it's always been the case. There's been a smaller number of institutions that can commit to that can provide that kind of funding. But in some models, more can benefit from it. But I'm concerned that, well, if people can't invest in it, to what degree are they going to be able to shape it going forward? And to what degree are they going to be able to benefit from that investment that others are making and that they are no longer able to make? And I'm not trying to wish ill on anybody. I just think this is going to be a potentially real question for a lot of us.
Yeah. And I think, you know, certainly there have been some interesting conversations coming out of Spark and the Investment in Open Infrastructure project around what some of these different models could look like, that might help us get to a different balance, at least for sustainability, right? But some of it is a question of whether or not we institutionally want to buy into a model that might actually give certain institutions less control, right? We're always going to need those institutions that are going to invest in the new and the shiny, right? Like we always need Michigan out there. We always need Indiana and Stanford out there pushing the envelope for us and testing out those new things because they have more money, because they have that resourcing. But then, you know, then we can't necessarily expect those institutions to sustain these things for us, right? If we've decided that this is valuable, if we've decided that's the case, we do need to think differently. And I think we need to think about where that money comes from within our budgets, right? So, I mean, you know, James Hilton's talked about this for years, about the idea of saying, you know, as we move to more open access, the libraries are paying less money for published materials. Maybe we can reinvest that money elsewhere. And I think that's valuable and important, but for institutions that really just don't have any wiggle room there, we do still need to figure out how to make them part of the conversation and have them be able to sit at the table, even if we have a model that doesn't say you're paying to play, right? How do we then make sure that we've set up, you know, advisory boards that are representative of the communities that are part of us? And maybe we recognize that sometimes we're going to end up focusing on or pushing on areas that are of tremendous interest to a very small group of people, but have huge impact for them, even if it doesn't have any real impact or value to a larger group, right? And I think that for all of us kind of grappling with the idea that, you know, I don't know, some smaller school might have that kind of power, some smaller institution, you know, I think there's you know, there is this sort of thing that our heads are kind of wrapped around, where we do buy into this idea of the value of membership, right? And I keep thinking that as budgets shrink, as things change, these membership groups are going to be struggling more and more and more, and we just have to think differently here.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I think I do feel like we've been lucky. We've been a little bit different in the way that I think when we came into being in the early part of this century, the community models were evolving, right, and being instigated. And you had, for HathiTrust, you had a lot of early adopters who invested really heavily, right? The Big Ten, University of California, and then they're kind of evolved to a model where more could join, and a conscious decision was made to make sure there was always going to be a way to fund future work, right? To kind of build not just sustainability, but really to be able to reinvest in the work that we're doing. So I think that's paid off for us in the long run. But I think a lot of times when we try to start up new programs since then, I feel like a lot of times we shoestring them, right? You know, like we just, you know, there's so much people are trying to do, we have to fund them to the minimum to get the stuff done. And then it's very hard to build the case for additional funding to reinvest in it going forward. So that's a little over here. And I just want to mention something here. You were talking about governance, you're talking about membership models. This is something we talked about, I talked a little bit about in our member meeting last week, but also the Board of Governors met last Wednesday. And we talked about some of the work we have ahead of us in the coming year. And one thing was very small, and it just had to do with, that question of who gets represented and how are we selecting leadership of the organization, right? There's a chair of the board. How is that chair of the board selected? What can we do to make that a more transparent process? But through that conversation, we really recognized, oh, this is it wasn't the first time I recognized it, but it's a much bigger organization. There are a lot of different challenges now. And we probably need to be thinking more actively about governance and how that will play out in the organization over the next few years. So no solutions, but a real recognition of the need there. Then the other thing that we discussed, I think, is more to your point, which is we really need to define a more clear membership strategy, for lack of a better word right now, that in the long run, our approach has been to grow by word of mouth. And that served us well, but it also means that if you aren't part of the community where the word of mouth is spreading, you may not feel that you are welcome to join that community, right? And you can look at our membership list and you can see ARL tiers, you can see Oberlin Group tiers, you can see lots of different communities, but there are some types of universities and colleges just not represented there. And to the degree that we talk about ourselves as creating a common good that's for the good of many, as well as differential services for members, right, that exclusionary thing, then some groups are being left out in that. And I think we've recognized we have to take a much more deliberate strategy around that and understand really what are the barriers we put in the way, right? Not just about money, but a technology or approach or, selling the value of the organization, if you will, about this. So.
Mike and Aviva, we have a couple of questions that I think this is a good point for us to go into, since the discussion so far has focused a little bit on cost and budget and value for organizations who join us. First question is about open access and is wondering whether anyone, and I think this means any libraries, are actually seeing any savings from investment in open access.
I'm not the person to answer that question because I haven't been able to track it so in a while.
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that specifically. Maybe the answer that I might give to that, instead of actually saying whether or not we're seeing a savings, is that I have been arguing with my provost discussing with my provost that it's not a question of savings. It's just a question of reallocation of where the money goes, right? So. Right. You may choose to have an open access fund and have the library responsible for it. The model may be that we push to have open access be something that is done from startup packages, right? There are different ways that we could do it. I don't actually think that we're going to see that either we're seeing real savings now, or if we saw a massive flip, that we would necessarily see those savings. I think that it would probably, I have a feeling, this is just me talking, that I have a feeling that a lot of those costs, if they got flipped to a different kind of model, would just get pulled from the library's budget somehow.
I would say too that if anyone who is listening in on the discussion has thoughts about this, we welcome you to put those into the chat so that we can continue the conversation there. Second question is about the idea of values-based approaches to library budgeting. The topic of values-based or values-driven collection development came up in a session earlier today about strengthening diversity, specifically in the HathiTrust collection. But this question is about budgeting. Do you think values-based approaches to library budgeting might help libraries make the case for supporting HathiTrust and other collective or community work? Thanks, Miranda, for that question.
I would say I hope so. I think the question of what I'm not sure in my own mind, I have a very clear sense of what values-based budgeting really means, to be honest with you, because, and I say that as somebody who's been sitting here in front of this computer screen, talking a lot about values and the organization's values and how we can better articulate those and get them understood and adopted. I think the way I have been thinking about it, let me not say we here, is that in developing a statement of values, what we're trying to do is articulate principles that we will try to filter our work through, that we'll try to hold up to the light and say, are we in line with this, or recognize where we're not, or where we're in conflict or in tension. And sometimes those are going to be very hard to reconcile. But I would like to think that if we can articulate, I guess one thing I've said a lot the past few months is that in our library community, it's clear there's a real value of dependence upon each other. It's one of the places where it's easy to recognize how much we're connected and how much our ability to succeed is reliant on others in the field. And that's obviously very relevant in the public health situation today. I feel like librarians get that. I don't know how easy it is to articulate that sometimes in higher education or, in writ large. Which is really focused on, a competitive mode. Kathleen Fitzpatrick talked about this last week, right? That we're in competition for resources with each other. They're competition for research dollars, for students, and so forth. And libraries are one of the places where that competition can only work against us, right? So I would like to say, yeah, Miranda, I hope so, but I'm not sure we have a lot of practice in articulating that in the way and the rest of the university gets it. Now, I'm going to encourage anybody who's on this call who's had a more successful conversation this past year, especially where you've succeeded in getting your faculty to agree to walk away from big deals. I mean, there's a very clear values conversation that's happened there. I'd love to hear about that and how you feel like that approach works. So.
I will just read out one comment from the chat and then I'll turn the conversation back over to you guys. Thanks. Tara says that the values proposition for HathiTrust was absolutely part of the faculty conversation that took place at their institution when the recommendation was made for them to join HathiTrust.
And that's fantastic. Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead, Viva. I just want to say yay.
Ahead,
no, I just had to say yay. Thank you.
So the thing that I was going to say was that I think if you look at some of the value statements that have come out of like Grand Valley or MIT that are helping them define how they are engaging with publishers and vendors, and then being able to then turn that back onto things like memberships, et cetera. I think it's been from what I understand, and I am not at either of those institutions, and so this is kind of purely from the outside, it seems like it's been very successful. And I think that is really great. And I think as an institution that did walk away from the big deal this year, we did not have a clear set of values for the entire system, but we did attend. There was a small group of us that did attend a meeting that California Digital Library helped organize for us around kind of what does it mean about the kind of moving to this idea of walking away from the big deal and what that might look like for us. And I think that at least the work and the conversations there really helped us to be able to refine and define what is valued to us as an institution and allowed us to walk into our negotiations with a very different mindset.
Were there any other questions, Natalie, or was that it for now?
That is it for now.
Okay. Aviva, I wonder if I could maybe turn us to talk about something related, but maybe a little bit different here. It's kind of, we're just talking a little bit about values-based, leadership, values-based decision-making, budgeting. We've already been talking a little bit about how some of these things play out at local levels as well as multi-institutional levels. And I wanted to turn our attention to talking about pursuit of equity and justice in our institutions, diversity initiatives, but more than that. Earlier this year, HathiTrust wrote to its members. This was in July, and the board wrote out and said that we've been having conversations about this, and we were recognizing the degree to which HathiTrust is embedded and situated in this whole system, in larger systems of knowledge sharing that are really shaped by long-standing power structures that are economical, that are racial, that are often set up to divide. And we needed to take time to understand how that shaped us, even where it may not be obvious. And that's why we need to take the time to understand it and explore it some more. And then begin to see where we can take action to remedy that. And one of the things I'm starting to try to think about here is how is that different in an organization like ours that is supported by many dozens or hundreds of other institutions, and how does that kind of conversation, how does that work play out at a local level in a single institution? And I wanted to ask you this because as a leader of a library, SUNY at Buffalo, then I feel like you've got a particular perspective on this, and we're just starting to really try to grapple with what this means and what tensions we're going to be dealing with in the community, if there are, if you will. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, if you don't mind terribly, I'm going to take 2 seconds to talk a little bit about some of the work that we did on the code of conduct for HathiTrust.
Oh yeah, that would be perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think your question is around like this sort of larger question of like, how do we kind of poke at the bear, as it were, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the big topics of conversation that the group ended up having was, how much can HathiTrust push that kind of value on the member institutions, and at what point does that end up actually potentially pushing your membership away from you, and whether or not there's the responsibility to take the stand, that if the stand is more important than the membership, right? Yeah. As it were, right? Yeah. And so that was a big topic of our conversation. We spent a lot of time grappling with it. I don't think any of us had a good answer. And I think membership organizations in the context of this DEI work, I think, are particularly tricky. I don't want to say problematic, I'll say tricky, because you're dealing with individuals who may agree with you at an institution that may not, or individuals who disagree with you at an institution who may, and how does that play out? And how do you, when you talk about like a code of conduct, right? And we talk about how you actually deal with what comes from a code of conduct and actually like adjudicating all of the activities that are sort of within that, what happens when you have an institution that doesn't, again, buy into the values that you're telling them that the people who attended this meeting are required to observe? And that's a really complex, thing. I don't have any good answers. I don't have a single good answer. But I will say that we spent a lot of time trying to thread the needle of saying, these are sort of behaviors that are expected of you that we are viewing as kind of basic civil activities that you should be engaging in. And this is the way we're going to try to address it if you're not. Some of them are around you individually and your engagement, and then but then at some point it becomes bigger than that. So this is a complicated one, and I think membership organizations are probably going to struggle with this for a while, especially if they are in spaces that are, where these conversations are much more sorry, let me rephrase that. It feels to me like most of the conversations that are existing in our space right now are around, how do we broaden the voices at the table, not shutting that down. But that's not to say that I don't think that sort of generally in membership organizations, you might not have that struggle, right? So we, I think, are all generally in the same space on many things, right? Implementation is always going to be a different thing. Right. As far as UB specifically, I've been here since last August, so it's a little over a year. And 7 months of that have been in the middle of a pandemic.
Welcome.
Thank you. I actually feel like it's worse for people who agreed to start a job like right when the pandemic started. We had an employee who started the day that lockdown started. It was terrible, right? Terrible. So, I will say that I think there have been a couple of things that I've done at my institution, for good or ill. There are some of my staff are on the call. They can tell you whether or not I've done this okay or not. But, I did start an equity social justice action group that is literally part of their job is to point out the things that we should be trying to focus our attention on, right? So whether that's about improving the collections or what we're collecting, highlighting other things in our collection, pointing out to me, for example, if I do something wrong. But I think that there's a lot of work we can do here that is looking inward, right? We can review our collection development policies. We can review how we prioritize purchasing, whose voice gets centered in those conversations or in those purchases, right? We need to start having more of those kinds of conversations about what we're bringing in and what we're highlighting at our institutions. And then, the other part of this conversation is also, how much of an investment your institution and you as a leader are willing to make in your institution on helping people understand the complexities here, right? So if, when you go on the internet, everything is sort of like dumbed down. It's kind of meme. That's the only way you sort of get it a lot of times. And you have to dig into things a lot more deeply. And, it's a struggle as an administrator to kind of balance, like, how far do I push my organization to where I'm at, right? So I know where I personally am, but how do I get my institution there? And there's so much I can do in my library, but there's also the larger institution that I'm a part of. And so all of that has to tie in. And so my job is both to push on the administration in one way, but also to either push or just step away and let my staff kind of push us in different directions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the points you were making about the challenge of working this out in membership organization is really important, and I something I'm feeling a fair amount in talking about this stuff and thinking it through. And I think your points you made about a code of conduct and thinking about that as focused on ethics and values informed norms, right? Of the ways of working, the ways of discussing, in a particular context is important. They have to be informed by the values. The question of how, as we've been talking about values, and the agenda for social justice or social justice and equity, addressing inequities in the services and so forth. It's like the question is, does everybody in the membership buy into that? Are they required to like check a box, right? And is that the right approach, or is it more of, whose values are these? And I said this last week that I felt like the best answer I can give to that right now is that in trying to articulate and formulate values, the best thing I can say is they're intended to be values and actions that those who lead the organization, those who carry out the organization's work, those who direct it, those who advise it, will work through when they're working on HathiTrust, right? And every institution has its own ways of stating its values. They're often similar, but they're not the same. And I'm confident there are probably organizations in the membership of HathiTrust that have values that would not show up in our values list, and vice versa. And so for us, I feel like we have to kind of keep the focus on, we're doing the work of the organization. We're asking you to help us do that, and being absolutely clear and absolutely transparent about that this is where we're going. In our conversation with among the Board of Governors last week, I should probably put what the values I'm talking about are in the chat, but let me just say this, please. We were talking about, we've developed this value statement. It's a draft. I shared it in the member meeting last week, but what do we need to do next? And we came to the conclusion that given the complexity of this and the importance of it, and this challenge of, adoption and articulation, the most important thing we could do is, share it in the form we have it, get feedback on it, edit it or revise it as we need to. But at the very end of it, we need to bring it back to membership and say, okay, are you willing for HathiTrust? Do you agree that HathiTrust should live or does live by these values? And essentially have the membership ratify that statement of values. It's not the same as, approving the budget or voting for a new chair or whatever. But it would be really important. And I think it's an important way to say, this is who we are. This is what we're about. Collectively, this is where we can go. And for me, it's about adopting those and working through our mission, right? It's like the mission we have to collect and organize and preserve and support teaching and research, all of that, that's where we can accomplish this. We can have other effects, but we have to kind of live it through that particular lens.
Agreed.
I don't know if you have anything you want to say. I need to catch my breath for a second.
I just noticed Natalie just unmuted her photo. So.
Oh, perfect.
I popped in only just to point out the time. We have about 20 minutes left in our session today. And Mike, I know you want a few minutes at the end to wrap us up, since this is our final session of the week. So for our attendees, if you have other questions, either about values or any of what we've talked about before, or any other questions or thoughts you'd like to share with Aviva and Mike, please put those into the chat. We probably have another 10 minutes or so to talk about anything that comes through the chat for Q&A. And I will now bounce back out.
Thanks. Just real quick, let me just, since I've been talking about values, and I haven't actually shown them to you, I shared them during the member meeting last week. Let me just real quick list these out, and I'm going to go largely by memory here. But so Maybe some context, right? The Statement of Values Code of Conduct Task Force did some work on this earlier in the year. They kind of interrogated a lot of material that HathiTrust had written about itself, came back out and said, here are a lot of questions, leadership of organization. Really, the values need to respond to these. What say you? And we said, you're right, we kind of need to respond to these. And so the values statement that we've been drafting is an attempt to be responsive to that, as well as, you know, articulating what we have felt to be the way we're working. So real quick, these include trust, right? That trust is something we're trying to build throughout the organization. It's core to our preservation mission, but really we need to be building trust in our work. And for that reason, we have to be accountable to you for what we say we're going to do and transparent in how we make decisions about these things. Also access, right? Access to knowledge. We're not just collecting and preserving stuff for its own sake. We're here to try to help people create knowledge, because that's really what society runs on, right? If we want a just society, we need to have more knowledge created, better knowledge, good knowledge created, if you will. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, yes, but beyond, you know, a recognition of inclusion and thinking about that as something strictly about staff, but really about work we can do as an organization to advance that, right? Not just who is at the table, but what do you find in our collection, and what can we do to affect systemic change in the library community around that. Related to that, constructive engagement, which relates to the code of conduct work that you're talking about there, Aviva, that if we're going to do this work, we have to be able to talk about it openly like this. Interdependence and resilience, especially right now, that if we're not trying to build resilience in our community, we're going to be finding ourselves much weaker going forward. And, you know, that's where we need to be focused in the next several years. And then lastly, you know, working as a leader, exerting leadership, but with both conviction and humility, right? You know, having the force of your convictions, but also just being willing to say you're going to screw it up, right? And you're going to fail, and you have to learn from that failure, and you're not the smartest kid on the block all the time, right? So, so more of that's going to be forthcoming. We don't have a full plan for how to get that out to everybody yet, but I promise you that over the next few weeks, we'll have more information out and we'll share that more widely. So thank you for letting me reprise my TED Talk from last week there. So.
I do have a question that I can insert here. Mike, you were talking just a moment ago about interdependence, which is the theme of this discussion more broadly, but also about resilience. And I think this question is really timely. The person is asking whether you or Mike could you or Aviva could summarize what was learned around shared print. And I think the question is in the context of community, not necessarily, you know, this week's sessions, but thinking about community and some of the points, Aviva, you were making about who gets to sit at the table and how those decisions are made and who benefits from those decisions. Whether you have any thoughts about how that plays out in HathiTrust as a community.
So is the question specifically about shared print, though? That's what I just needed to.
Yes,
okay,
it is specifically about shared print. Sorry.
Okay. I'm running through my head who asked that question here, the anonymous question. Aviva, do you want to take a stab, or do you want me to?
I'd like you go ahead.
Okay. So these are very random thoughts. Shared print over the last 25 years or so has been all about how do libraries work together to ensure that they will collectively have access to stuff. And at the same time, allow them to more effectively manage those collections so that they don't have to have as much space taken up, right? I mean, that's kind of a clumsy way of saying it, but digitization led to the realization. I mean, JSTOR was all about, we've got all this stuff and all the space invested in print, we can provide access through JSTOR, and libraries can divest themselves of some of it. But you need to have ways of keeping it, and you need to have trust networks that help do that. I think those trust networks have worked pretty well, but they're premised around one thing, or one or two things, and one of them is access, right? I trust you to keep that book and to get me a copy of it when I need it. And I trust you especially because I've worked with you before, and because you are close to me and you can get that book to me within 48 hours or something like that. And I'm not going to have my faculty yelling at me as much about it, right? What I think has happened, especially in the United States, is because of the basis of this, you're working with the groups. We've talked about this already. You work with the people you know, the people you already trust. you build around that, then you have dozens of these networks established, and you start to have the networks of the big organizations in a particular region, but then the smaller organizations who can't participate in that start to have their own network that comes up. And I think it's, I mean, it's the way it's worked, and it works okay, but it's also a big menu for a lot of inefficiency in the whole system, as well as potential loss. So I don't know if I have a lesson about this, but I think one of the things I've learned really from working with Heather and before her Lizanne Payne and the others folks in the organization who work on shared print, all of you out there, is just how fractured the network is, how little information there is that is commonly shared, how little infrastructure there is to even take a national approach on this at this particular time. And I'm not sure if that's getting at the question, but I do think that issue of trust plays out very much at local level. And then the question as we back out and try to do any kind of coordination at a national level is, how much do you really trust, or can you trust, or how much blind trust can you have for this over here to still be there for you? Anyway, that's just a little bit of a rambling thought.
And the other piece that I think about when you say that, though, and this is it's a tangent at this point, but those networks are based on privilege, right? They're based on who is already at that table, whatever table that may be. And when you're talking about predominantly white, predominantly male-led institutions, even the structure of the idea of the network, right, is potentially, there's patriarchy in there, there's racism in there. There's a lot that's in there that we could spend time unpacking as well. But, I think it is one of the complexities that we have, right? Because it is hard to sort of imagine how else we might do it other than through those networks, right? Mm-hmm. But we, I think, also just need to recognize that those networks have their own limitations.
I just see a quick comment coming in here from Jeff at Duke that shared print and other community preservation efforts are outstanding examples of ways we make systems that require us to continue to collaborate at scale, not just trust, but unbreakable interdependence, build a system that requires us to need each other. I think that's absolutely right. I think just in the shared print space, it's emerged at local, more regional levels than it has at national levels. And I feel like, well, I won't say anything else. I've been rambling enough here. So,
but the point is for us to ramble, right? That's
true. This tightly rehearsed discussion today.
It is now about 10 minutes before the end. So, any final thoughts from either of you? And then, Mike, I think you have some parting words for us.
Aviva, let me turn it over to you because I do get the last word here. So.
Oh, well, well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is always fun, and I'm happy to, blather on for hours about lots of these topics. But Jeff does bring up a really good point. I think building a system that requires us to need each other, I think, is valuable and kind of a key point of what is actual sustainability going to mean. We need to be responsible to each other beyond just we've said that we're all going to be part of this thing, right? We need to figure out a way of making that interdependence critical to us rather than just it's nice for us. I think that might be my closing thought.
Thanks. And then making sure that you're aware of who is invited in on that, right, is the other point that you were making a second ago too. So.
Yeah, I mean, look, the not just who's invited, but who's actually just getting that message, right? I mean, I think about this a lot. It shocked me actually the first time that I went to IFLA and I was talking to some colleagues about HathiTrust, and they never heard of it. Mm-hmm. And it was a shock to me because I couldn't believe that they hadn't heard of it, right? But there is, these networks of people, you're absolutely right, that we do need to think very differently about them and how we reach out to them and how we engage with them. And the voices at the table, we spent a lot of time, again, in the code of conduct meeting. Jennifer Vinnipal, who was leading our group, is a white woman. I'm a white woman. We were, there were other people in that group, but, Jennifer and I, even in that work, we spent a lot of time being quiet and sitting back and listening. And I think that's, that's the other piece of this, is that we need to think about how we can better center some of those voices in these conversations.
That's an excellent point to end on. Aviva, thank you so much for being my verbal foil here this afternoon. I really appreciated it. And we don't often get a chance to have these kinds of conversations, especially now because we're not traveling and we're not meeting up at the conferences and having these kinds of debates and or just discussions. And I really appreciate the opportunity that that we've had to do that today. I do have a few last things to talk about here, just to do the logistical housekeeping kind of thing here. So let me just see if I can share my screen without showing you my email here. How about this? Can you all see a slide that says a few things more?
Yes, thanks, Mike.
Beautiful. All right, first thing I want to do is steal a slide that I think Natalie's supposed to show at the end, just to say that after this, you will get a survey about this particular session as well as Community Week. And please respond to that. We're trying to figure out what we do with this next year. You can also continue the conversation on our HathiTrust community Slack area. It's under the Community Week channel on social media. There's a hashtag there for you. And if you're on either of those and you want to touch base with me about anything I've said today, then the handle for me is @MikeFurlow. I've learned a lot this week, not just about HathiTrust and what you think, but also about how speech to text works when it tries to translate HathiTrust into a textual representation. This is not a complete list of every transcription of HathiTrust that appears in the transcriptions in Zoom over the last week, but it's a pretty representative list. So my favorite here is, of course, the HathiTrust at the start there. That was the most popular one, by the way. I want to say thanks also to those of you who took part in our member meeting last week, those of you who attended, but also especially the speakers. They made the meeting happen. They made the meeting what it was, and they spoke, some with a great deal of candor and others with a great deal of efficiency about the work they were doing. And it was, all of it was amazing and just incredibly gratifying for me to be a part of. I also want to thank Community Week speakers, because this week was not, I mean, it was work, right? But it was, the real work was done by y'all who prepared presentations, who thought about what you wanted to convey, and then were very thoughtful in doing so. So here are some of the speakers from this week in Community Week, and here are other speakers from this week in Community Week, something like 27, 28 different people at least. And if I've left anyone off, I apologize, and just say so in chat there. Next group I want to thank is the Planning Committee for the member meeting and Community Week. Jeffrey Archer, who moved just at the start of the pandemic. We were talking about that last night. Mark Christel, Sharon Favre, Holly Mercer, Jessica Rohr, Matthew Sheehy, Melissa Stewart, and Heather Welton all put together this program. They all thought of what to do in this week, and they put together a fantastic plan. I need to especially call out, though, both Jessica, Melissa, and Heather, because they carried the water and set this up to be a success, and told all of us on the team what we had to do, when, and what to say, and did so with an amazing degree of skill and clarity, and it just was amazing to watch. And so I thank all of you, all three of you in particular, but then the Planning Committee as a whole for putting this together. It's just been fantastic. I have a few more slides here. A couple of comments have been made today about how we got to hear this week from the folks on the ground, right? And there's certainly leadership involved in this. In the member meeting last week, we acknowledged the board and the program steering committee. I wanted to talk a little bit about everybody else who's part of HathiTrust here. And I wanted to do that by talking about and acknowledging the fact that a lot of individuals make the work happen. For example, copyright review. We've talked about this before, but it's been done over 10 years by individuals at your institutions who've contributed their time to investigating the status of works that appear to be in copyright. And Christina told us very recently, we've now looked at over 900,000 titles. We've done determinations on over almost 1 million titles, and more than half of those have been opened up and made available in the public domain. So this is one list of individuals, which you cannot read because there's so many who have done this work. Here is a continuing list of individuals, people who have been able to do this work, including folks in the United States and in Canada, and it continues even on to a third screen. So all of these people are HathiTrust, not just the people who have been here on the screen. In addition, the user support team, we had a fantastic session earlier this week about user support, where some of this team got time to share what they learn, what they get from doing this work. They are all doing it on their own time. They all devote hours of their week to being on call, essentially, and their work is invaluable, and I thank all of them for doing this. And it's not just the Bibliographic Corrections group or the General Support group, but it's also the Digital Objects Quality Corrections Group, who take feedback from individuals saying, this one is really screwed up, can you fix it, and do their best to try to get that resolved. We also have folks who work at different institutions who provide hosting support for the organization. I mentioned last week, Indiana University, University of Illinois, California Digital Library, and the University of Michigan. They all are providing in-kind support in some way to HathiTrust. And at Indiana and Illinois, that's through the HathiTrust Research Center. John Walsh talked about them last week, so I won't spend too much time, but I just want to ensure that you have a chance to see the names of the people who work at the Research Center, who provide the leadership here, as well as a host of people on the ground who spend all or part of their time supporting the work of the Research Center, managing the infrastructure, working with users, translating data, extracting data, publishing that data for others. Similarly, let me thank these folks, Charlie Collett, Claudia Conrad, Jiang Jiang, Barbara Cormack at California Digital Library, who managed the Zephyr metadata management system. That's managing 20 million bibliographic records for the works that you see in HathiTrust. They also do fabulous work. At the University of Michigan in the Library Information Technology Group, here's just 6 people who are responsible for developing, maintaining, and keeping running the infrastructure that runs HathiTrust Digital Library. There are many others at the University of Michigan I ought to be thanking here. I wanted to try to, here in particular though, call out these 6, because these 6 people are the folks who make sure that you can access this stuff on a daily basis in and out. So thanks to them. And then lastly, but not leastly for me anyway, thanks to my team, the HathiTrust staff, Heather Christensen, Graham Detmers, Christina Hall, Aaron Elkis, Natalie Fulkerson, Eleanor Kale, Sandra McIntyre, Jessica Rohr, Melissa Stewart, Heather Welton, and Angelina Zaitsev, who all look different from these photos now. So it's time for us to get new photos, gang. All of us have just tremendously enjoyed these past couple of weeks and this week and talking with you and sharing the work with you. So thank you very much to each of these. These are the most fabulous people I've ever had to work with. And so next year, we'll see you again. Date and time to be determined, but we will do it again. And thanks to every one of you. I'm going to go wind down. And fortunately, for the next 5 days, there's absolutely nothing happening that's going to cause me any stress whatsoever. So I am totally looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks very much, everyone. If we were all together in Chicago, I think the last thing we would do is wish you safe travels. Instead, I will wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again at whatever we do next. I'm going to stop the recording, and I will hang out just a minute in case there are any last things we need to do. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.